back to History Class with Dr. W and our continuing discussion of American culture. In the previous lectures, we've looked at culture in the early 1970s, which revolved around a generally grim and skeptical tone as life in America confronted many issues. By the mid-1970s, we begin to see what might be described as a lifting of the fog, as many in the popular culture realm began to explore more positive, uplifting, or perhaps escapist themes. In this lecture, we're going to look at some examples of that kind of culture from the mid-1970s, beginning with and looking at a few of the biggest blockbuster films of the decade. By the mid to late 1970s, that group of young directors who had experimented in the early 1970s on low-budget films began to blossom into some of the biggest producers and directors in the history of cinema, including names like George Lucas, Steven Spielberg, and Sylvester Stallone. Both Lucas and Spielberg spent their early careers making serious and in some cases dark films. The most notable success came with George Lucas' 1973 American Graffiti, which was made in 28 days and cost less than $1 million. The setting of the film was the year 1962, and its theme was one of loss of innocence. Around the corner for those kids was the assassination of John F. Kennedy, Vietnam, and the troubles of the 1960s. In the mid-1970s, both directors began to move in different directions. Spielberg's smash production, Jaws, in 1975, and Lucas's Star Wars in 1977, remain within the top 7 biggest box office successes of all time, adjusted for inflation. Jaws in some ways represented an indictment of the American system, with the main villain being a stubborn local politician who insists on leaving the beaches open so his town can reap the profits. But on a practical level, Jaws also introduced the Hollywood blockbuster and showed the movie studios what a film might do if marketed to its fullest. Jaws demonstrated the viability of saturation release, meaning that it opened across the country in thousands of theaters simultaneously. Prior to this, it was customary for a film to open in steps, first in a small number of theaters in major markets, then spreading gradually across the country. Jaws also generated a massive souvenir market, as t-shirts and shark dolls and toys brought in millions in more income in addition to the success of the film itself. Star Wars in 1977 took the model created by Jaws and blew it out of the universe. It grossed 50% more than Jaws. It also convinced Hollywood that viewers, especially the young, were willing to see a movie repeatedly if it was compelling enough. Some viewers saw Star Wars dozens or even hundreds of times. In order to sell the film, George Lucas made a deal that seemed insane at the time. He agreed to take no fee for making the film itself, but gained sole control of merchandising and sequels. Sales of Star Wars action figures, lunchboxes, toys, and t-shirts were astounding. The movie also began immediate anticipation for the sequel, which was The Empire Strikes Back, released in 1980. Lucas grew up and started his career in a culture of movies filled with action and with clear heroes and villains. Frustrated by the bleak and sometimes confusing films of the late 60s and early 70s, he hoped to recreate that atmosphere in Star Wars. He said at one point, "There's a whole generation growing up without any kind of fairy tales." For many young fans, Star Wars was the same kind of cultural revolution as Beatlemania in the 1960s. In the summer of 1977, millions of kids went to see Star Wars over and over again. By the late 1980s, adolescents represented more than 80% of the ongoing movie audience. Adolescents were also at the core for the audience for Sylvester Stallone's Rocky. Stallone, a little-known actor at that time, wrote the screenplay about a working-class boxer who battles the heavyweight champion. A genuine surprise. The film earned $74 million, costing less than $1 million to make, and won the Academy Award for Best Picture. Hollywood soon became obsessed with blockbusters. It was a gold rush mentality and proved fraught with peril. Movie success now hinged on opening weekend, and producers and directors now worked under enormous pressure to produce the next blockbuster. The trend spelled bad news for independent filmmakers and small budget directors like Robert Altman and Francis Ford Coppola. Many independent studios went under, and control at the movie houses returned to the executives and away from the directors. Altman produced a number of critical successes in the mid-1970s, but no box office hits, and by the end of the decade he had been pushed to the fringes of filmmaking. Coppola hinged all his hopes on his artistic masterpiece, Apocalypse Now. The filming took 3 years and went 3 times over budget. It sputtered at the box office, barely regaining its investment. Considered a cult classic by many, it damaged Coppola's reputation and led the Hollywood establishment to view him with caution. Another box office bust, Heaven's Gate, released in 1980, was such a failure that it almost destroyed United Artists. Even after being recut and re-released in 1981, it remained an utter disaster for the company. The big hits of the late 1970s included an array of generally feel-good movies. Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind in 1977, Grease in 1978, Animal House in 1978, and Superman in 1978 as well, were some of the biggest hits of the decade. Such films demonstrated that the dismal mood of the early 70s was past, and that the American public, particularly its youth, craved heroes, humor, and nostalgia. By the late 1970s, popular culture reflected a desire of Americans for simple pleasures, happiness, and feeling good. The comedian Steve Martin is one example. As a young comedian, he had been a writer for the Smothers Brothers. By the mid-1970s, he was shedding his more serious side and adopted a persona he called a wild and crazy guy in his stand-up. He wore arrows through his head, made balloon shapes, juggled cats, and other ridiculous things. As one commentator said, Martin is exactly right for the times. We're burned out on relevance and anger. He offers a special form of escape, and there is no hostility in his act. Other comedians in a similar vein included Chevy Chase and Bill Murray. In 1975, they teamed with other talents like John Belushi, Dan Aykroyd, and Gilda Radner to form the original cast of Saturday Night Live. It offered a forum for a similar brand of harmless comedy. With skits like The Land Shark and Japanese Deli, SNL became a staple entertainment for the 18 to 34 age group and remains on the air even today. Other television shows of the mid to late 70s reflected a similar feel-good theme. The Waltons was a family show that made even the Great Depression look good and featured family values of togetherness and trust. Little House on the Prairie, which aired from 1974 to 1983, was set on the western frontier and showed that the Ingalls family survived through determination and love. Shows like Happy Days and Laverne and Shirley brought back an idealized version of the innocent and fun 1950s. And Welcome Back, Kotter bounced lightly through the perils of high school with its portrayal of a caring teacher and his group of sweat hogs. They were a superficially tough group of inner-city outcasts. Ethnically diverse, nonetheless, they exemplified unity and togetherness. Some programming broke this mold and made a sincere attempt to tap into the greater social and racial understanding that was evident in the country by the late 70s. The epic miniseries Roots aired on ABC in February 1977. It aired over 8 consecutive nights and set audience records. Almost half of the American public watched the final episode. Hundreds of mayors around the country declared that week Roots Week, and hundreds of college and high schools used Alex Haley's book as a foundation for Black history courses. The TV series Roots contributed in a very real way to an interest in Black history in the country, and had some impact on public policy. After the show aired, genealogists pressured the government to release sealed documents related to the history of slavery, and many African Americans attempted to trace their own roots back to their African ancestors. In our next lecture, we'll turn to another realm in which the quest for equality featured prominently, the realm of sports.